Today we're going to talk about the semicolon. I'm a bit reluctant to discuss this mark of punctuation with you because semicolons are a stylistic option for writers, but there's not really a situation where semicolons are absolutely required. I suppose there's one rare occasion where you might have to use semicolons, but I'm pretty sure most of you can get through life without needing to use them. In any case, I'll briefly go over the rules and I'll let you know that semicolons are somewhat relevant to conjunctive adverbs, which we're also covering in this module. Okay, so one way you can use the semicolon is to separate items in a detailed list, in a list that has internal punctuation, where you might have commas in there for other reasons. In a list like this, you want to substitute semicolons for the commas you would ordinarily use to separate these items. This rarely occurs, but you might find yourself writing a list like this someday where you have commas in there for other reasons. So if we look at this example, here we're having lunch with Bill, comma, my neighbor, Sally, comma, my coworker, and Fred, comma, my best friend. Since we have this internal punctuation, we have to put semicolons between the broader items in our list. So we have a semicolon after neighbor and a semicolon after coworker. That's one function of the semicolon, and it gets used very rarely. The more common use of the semicolon also gets used rarely, but it occurs more frequently than this first usage. The more common use of the semicolon is to use it to separate two closely related sentences. So this is a stylistic choice a writer can make. It's really up to the writer to decide whether their sentences are closely related enough, and stylistically, it's something that you want to use sparingly. You don't want lots of semicolons in your paper. Use it occasionally if you feel like a period is too much separation between two ideas. So here we have an example. It's not what you say, it's how you say it. These sentences are so closely related that a lot of people would punctuate it as one sentence, but then they would have a run-on or a comma splice. Grammatically, these are two separate statements, but since one answers the other, they seem so closely related that a lot of people would be uncomfortable with a period here. So if you ever feel like that, if you're trying to fix a comma splice or a run-on, for instance, but you feel like a period is too much separation, you can fix it by using a semicolon instead. And in that case, the semicolon works as a soft period. It indicates the end of one clause, but it doesn't divide it as much as a period would. So a semicolon is a stylistic choice you can make. However, you just have to be certain that both sides are complete. If you're tempted to use a semicolon this way, ask yourself, would a period work? And if a period would be grammatically correct, then a semicolon will also be grammatically correct. Just remember, if you choose to use semicolons, use them sparingly, and don't use semicolons unless you know the rules. If you misplace a semicolon in your writing, you will create a fragment. In this next statement, for example, we have a fragment. This next statement reads, even though I don't know how to use semicolons, I'm going to sprinkle them all over my paper. So here we have a semicolon where we actually need a comma. This is why you want to be careful if you do choose to use semicolons. I don't know how to use semicolons would be a complete statement, but this conjunction even though subordinates it and creates a subordinate clause or a dependent clause. It's a dependent clause because it depends on the rest of this statement to complete it. So since this cannot stand alone, since this first part is not a complete sentence, this semicolon creates a fragment. We want a comma, not a semicolon. So again, when you're using semicolons this way, look at it as a soft period. If you feel like your clauses are so closely related that a period would be too much separation, go ahead and use the semicolon, but just make sure each side is complete. If a period is grammatically correct, your semicolon will also be grammatically correct. So in this next statement we have, next weekend I'm going fishing, semicolon. Fishing has always been one of my favorite pastimes. This statement is fine because both sides are complete. We have a complete sentence before the semicolon. We have a complete sentence after the semicolon. So grammatically, a period would be correct. That means that this semicolon is correct. So again, it's like a soft period. If a period would be too much separation, a semicolon is a stylistic option you can choose. You still want to use them sparingly. And then when you use them, the second half does not get capitalized unless you're capitalizing it for another reason. So if the second clause starts with a proper noun, like, somebody's name or the name of a business, or if it happens to start with the pronoun I, then yeah, capitalize it for other reasons. But unless one of those reasons applies, you want to keep the second half of this lowercase.